Make America Great Again. The first word of the Republican movement slogan gives an important insight into how greatness is defined. For my whole life, and almost certainly for yours, a country's economy has been defined by what it produces. Cars, ships, computers, skyscrapers, steel, weapons, fashion, food. Think of a country and the chances are you'll link it with a product. Swiss watches, American cars, Italian fashion, French wine, Japanese TVs. But here's the thing, the battle for making is mostly over. It's been decisively won. Though that doesn't really matter because a new battle is underway, the battle for powering. This is about producing the thing that enables everything else, electricity. It's a long-term play. It's going to be a focus of governments for decades. But right now, there's one country with a decisive advantage in the current technology, which is also positioned to dominate the technologies of the future. And that country is China. I'm going to look at the most advanced and potentially the most transformative technology currently being developed around the world. A source capable of fulfilling all our energy needs without harming the planet. That is fusion power. And right now, the development of this technology looks like it's following a very similar path that could see it controlled by the government in Beijing. Before we get on to electricity, we'll need to discuss trade. That's the making part again, because the seeds of the future have already been sown in the past. It's a story which is broadly already well known. After all, we've all lived through it. But it's not quite universally understood, neither by policymakers nor the public at large. And it's essential to have a grasp on how categorically China outplayed its economic competitors. And once we understand where we are now, we can look at the next few years, what we can call the green transition. This is mainly about replacing large chunks of our electricity generation with new, cleaner sources of power. And then finally, we'll set our sights much more firmly into the future and explore the energy upscaling. This is where things get quite sci-fi, and it's probably not an exaggeration to say it's where the future of humanity gets decided. Because with enough energy, we can desalinate seawater and irrigate fields and even light up crops at night. We can live comfortably in the coldest climes or the hottest. There are really few problems that humanity couldn't conceivably solve given enough energy. So whoever controls the energy controls the future. The China-US trade conflict of 2025 will be seen as a decisive moment in the global power balance. Donald Trump had been beating down allies and enemies alike with his swinging imposition of tariffs, threatening to restrict access to the world's biggest market. Everyone capitulated: the UK, Europe, Japan, the Philippines, Pakistan, South Korea, making concessions in return for slightly lower import duties. They didn't get Trump to reverse his policy, they just agreed to give up something in return for slightly less bad deal. This was deal-making on Trump's terms, befitting America's status as the #1 superpower. But one country didn't give way: China. So Trump pushed harder. In February, 10% additional duties. March, that went up to 20%, then 54%, then 104%, and finally, by mid-April, more than 125%. China responded, but it didn't give way because it had a plan. It had been building its plan for decades, developing an ultimate weapon more effective than even huge taxes on its exports. And that was its critical minerals lever. So in April, as things got heated, China dropped a bomb and said that it could limit exports of rare earth minerals, absolutely none of which you've probably ever heard of. Samarium, gadolinium, terbium, dysprosium, lutetium, scandium, yttrium. Now the main purpose of these minerals is to make very powerful magnets. As China produces up to 90% of the global supply, the export restrictions risked denying them to US industry altogether. And that, at least partly, was enough to get Trump to back down on his proudly announced powerful tariffs. Why does everyone care so much about strong magnets? We'll come to that. Of course, there are other things going on too. China's successful diversification of its trade partners, facilitated by the Belt and Road project stretching around the world. But the point I want to make here is that through years of investment, by incentivizing companies, easing environmental regulations and controlling exports, the Chinese government managed to get itself into a position where it could shut down entire industries around the world. Trump caved. Not something we've seen him do often, but he very obviously blinked and backed down. After a meeting with Xi Jinping, the tariffs were wound back without Beijing really giving up anything. That's one example amongst so many. We all saw during the pandemic that in terms of producing surgical equipment and personal protection products, there are no players in the world who can compete with China. During the 2000s, China built a stranglehold over low-cost goods, but then it moved into the biggest revolution of that time, the communications transformation, the most iconic product of the period, the mobile phone. Initially, this market was dominated by brands like Nokia, Sony and Motorola. Today, 7 of the top 9 biggest phone manufacturers in the world are Chinese, and most Apple and Samsung devices are also made in China. So that is how China has executed long-term plans to take key positions in strategic supply chains. It's a masterclass in economic planning. We're going to move on to the ultimate clean power source. But first, we have to talk about the state of play now. Because even if bigger change is coming, right now we're experiencing a shift in how we make energy, which is more significant than anything since the first mass power plants came online in the late 19th century. The charts are dramatic. Look at the growth in wind power and solar. And if you look at the breakdown, guess which country stands out? China has increased its wind power capacity 6-fold since 2013, and its solar capacity by 180 times. It accounts for almost half of the world's capacity already, and it's growing at much faster rates than anywhere else. But you might have heard also that China is still building new coal power plants. These are partly to pick up the slack when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine, but they're also part of just a mammoth scaling of China's energy production. Many observers suggest that with China's population declining, the country is building more capacity than it currently seems to need. It's readying itself for a future in which energy is literally power. And in keeping with Beijing's playbook, this isn't just a domestic success story. China has more than 80% of the world's solar panel production and about 60% for wind turbines. 6 of the top 10 international manufacturers are currently Chinese, and that will rise. And the story doesn't even stop there. We could equally talk about batteries or electric vehicles. But again, this is basically old news, and I want to take us forward. So here we get to see the process from the beginning, because nuclear fusion is genuinely an emerging technology, which is only now becoming more than a theoretical possibility. A quick background. Unlike nuclear fission, which is how the nuclear power plants of today work, nuclear fusion is not about splitting large atoms to release energy. It's the opposite. Nuclear fusion takes the smallest atoms and forces them together. It has several advantages over fission. In terms of safety, it can't create a meltdown like was seen in Chernobyl. The reaction is much easier to halt. It produces far less and less dangerous waste and requires much less fuel. And unlike wind and solar, it can run year-round, day and night. The hydrogen needed to power it can also be found virtually anywhere. So there are many reasons to believe this is the technology which will power humanity's future. And one more quick point you'll need to understand. There are no commercial fusion reactors operating successfully at the moment. This is still in the test phase, and the best way of doing it isn't yet clear. The most advanced developments have been based on holding a superheated cloud of plasma in a vacuum by using magnets. And when I say superheated, I'm talking about 100 million degrees Celsius. That's more than 6 times hotter than the sun. Obviously nothing solid can touch that, which is why the magnets are needed to hold it in place. The other main technology produces the heat by firing lasers at the hydrogen fuel. So one path requires serious magnets and the other serious lasers. Now, I said this was a new technology. The first stages were almost exclusively funded by governments, sometimes in collaborative ventures, as the costs were so high. But private investment is gradually coming in, particularly from wealthy individuals who can afford to wait longer for a return and want to back world-changing projects. In 2022, that private investment coming from China was virtually zero. Last year, it probably passed $3 billion. That's double the rest of the world combined. Can you see what's happening? Earlier, we mentioned the rare earth minerals, where China has almost monopolized global production. These are key to the supermagnets used in fusion reactors. And tritium, for instance, which is alloyed with steel to produce heat-proof structures, was on that list of minerals subject to export controls. 90% of the US's supply originates in China. And there's something else you need too, and that's called high temperature superconducting tape, HTS tape. It does what it says on the tin, which is it conducts electricity really well when it's very hot. In this case, being around minus 200 degrees C. If you've been listening closely, you won't be surprised to hear that China controls 85% of global production of this HTS tape, and it's on track to increase its output 5-fold. And the other essential element? Lasers. 70% of laser diodes in the world are made in China, and they're already 3 times cheaper than the 30% made elsewhere. So production is only headed in one direction, and that's without speaking of countless other materials, which are basically essential to the process. Tungsten, used for its heat and pressure resistant properties, 80% from China. Vanadium, which is particularly well suited to absorbing neutron radiation, 67% from China. Barium titanate, at the heart of the powerful capacitors which can control the electrical pulses essential to managing the process. 85% refined in China. Even graphene, a much more widely used material across electricity transmission systems, is similar. 70% produced in China. Energy isn't just a part of the economy. It's literally the fuel of the economy. Almost nothing works without it. From producing food to powering AI. From heating and transport to defense. Without energy, everything stops. And it's at a critical juncture. Previously, it's been supplied by fossil fuels. Most countries have some access to coal or oil or gas. And those that haven't have long established and secure supply chains to get hold of fuels they can burn to create electricity. But energy supply is going through a transformation. In the developed world, growth in demand for electricity has been basically flat for a long time as more efficient appliances have offset increased usage. In the US, demand increased at well below 1% a year for the first 2 decades of this century. But that period is over. AI is perhaps the best known driver of a surge in power consumption, but the simultaneous phasing out of fossil fuels in the transport industry and heating is a second massive factor. This transformation will decide the future of the planet. The first stage of change has been not only led, but controlled by China. In 20 years, China grew from 10% of global solar panel production to 85%. Lithium batteries are the same story. In 2010, the market was dominated by Korean and Japanese businesses like Panasonic and Samsung, but China created demand by bolstering its EV industry, vertically integrated supplies to cut costs, and captured 3/4 of the world market over the next decade. We've also discussed rare earths, where the playbook was highly similar. The US controlled 50% of world production in 2000, but China made mining and processing a strategic priority, and by 2020 had 95% of the world market. Now, you may be absolutely fine with the way things are going. For many developing nations, cheap Chinese solar panels have been game changers for delivering energy to citizens and empowering them to join the global economy. In more developed nations, Chinese electric cars are making net zero goals attainable, but policymakers are likely to be less sanguine. When the US attacked Venezuela, the first thing it did was to cut the lights. For all the investments that countries are making in their militaries, the real power of the future will go to those who control power generation.